The night air above the Nile River carried a softness that was difficult to describe. Even after the heat of the day had settled into the stones and mud walls of the villages, the darkness brought a gentle coolness that slowly drifted over the water. Small waves touched the riverbank with quiet sounds. Reeds moved softly in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. In the villages and towns of ancient Egypt, most people were already asleep. They slept on simple mats woven from reeds. Some rested on low wooden beds with linen coverings. Others slept directly on rooftops beneath the stars when the summer heat became too heavy inside their homes. Families slept close together. Children listened to the sounds of their parents' breathing. Outside, the night insects sang their endless songs beneath the moonlight. It is here, in these quiet hours before dawn, that our journey begins. When people think of ancient Egypt, they often imagine kings, pyramids, temples, and treasures. But most people who lived beside the Nile River never saw the inside of a palace. They never wore gold jewelry or commanded armies. Their lives were shaped by something much simpler and much more powerful. Their lives were shaped by discipline. Not the discipline of punishment alone, although punishment certainly existed. Not the discipline of soldiers marching beneath banners. But the slow, ordinary discipline of daily life. The discipline of waking before sunrise. The discipline of carrying water. The discipline of learning a trade. The discipline of obeying elders. The discipline of enduring heat, hunger, exhaustion, and responsibility. For many children born along the Nile thousands of years ago, growing up was not a journey toward freedom. It was a long lesson in duty. As the stars slowly faded above the eastern horizon, movement began to return to the villages scattered along the riverbanks. The air remained cool, but only for a short while. Everyone understood that the heat would come soon. A young boy sleeping beside his brothers stirred beneath a linen cloth. He heard his father's footsteps first. Then came the sound of clay jars being lifted. Outside, someone was already feeding a donkey. Nearby, a woman ground grain against stone, creating a steady scraping sound that had greeted countless mornings for countless generations. The boy opened his eyes. He was perhaps 8 years old. By modern standards, he was still very young. But in ancient Egypt, childhood had already begun to change around him. The games of his earliest years were becoming less important. New expectations were arriving quietly, one day at a time. He sat up slowly. The room around him remained dark except for a small oil lamp. The walls were made of mud brick. They held the warmth of yesterday's sun. Dust rested in the corners. The smell of bread dough and smoke lingered in the air. His father did not speak much. He simply nodded toward the doorway. The boy understood. There was work to do. Outside, dawn stretched slowly across the Nile Valley. Palm trees stood motionless against the pale sky. The river itself seemed almost asleep, reflecting the first light of morning with perfect calm. The boy followed his father toward the fields. Their sandals pressed softly into the dirt path. Around them, other families emerged from their homes. Men carried tools. Women balanced baskets. Older children walked quietly beside their parents. No one hurried, but no one delayed either. Everyone knew the rhythm. Everyone understood their place within it. The fields beside the Nile demanded constant attention. The river gave life, but only to those willing to work with patience and discipline. Irrigation channels needed cleaning. Crops required care. Animals needed feeding. Every season brought different responsibilities, and every responsibility required knowledge learned through repetition. For children, this learning began early. Very early. A young child might begin by carrying small baskets or gathering reeds. Later came heavier tasks. More difficult tasks. Responsibilities increased slowly, almost invisibly, until one day the child discovered that childhood itself had quietly disappeared. The boy walked beside his father without complaint. He had learned already that complaints solved nothing. The morning air smelled of wet soil. Birds called from the riverbank. Insects hummed among the crops. Ahead, several workers were already clearing an irrigation ditch. Their movements were slow and practiced. The father handed the boy a small wooden tool. The boy accepted it without hesitation. No lesson needed explanation. He had watched these movements for years. He had seen older brothers perform them. He had watched neighbors perform them. He had observed adults repeating the same motions every day beneath the same sun. This was how knowledge passed from one generation to another. Not through long speeches. Through repetition. The sun climbed higher. Soon, the coolness disappeared. Heat settled over the fields like a heavy blanket. Sweat formed beneath linen clothing. Dust clung to skin. The workers continued without speaking very much. The boy's arms grew tired. His back began to ache. He shifted his weight from one foot to another. His father noticed. But he said nothing. The lesson itself was the teacher. In ancient Egypt, endurance was often considered part of education. Life demanded endurance. Therefore children learned endurance. Not because anyone wished to be cruel, but because survival itself required strength, patience, and discipline. As morning became afternoon, the village seemed to retreat from the heat. Dogs rested in the shade. Donkeys stood quietly. Even the birds became less active. The workers paused briefly to eat. Bread. Onions. Perhaps dried fish. Water carried in clay jars. The boy sat beside his father beneath the narrow shadow of a tree. Neither spoke much. They simply ate and listened to the sound of insects singing in the fields. Far away, the Nile continued its endless journey northward. The river had witnessed countless childhoods. It had watched generations grow from playful children into tired adults. And always, the process remained remarkably similar. A child learned by watching. A child learned by obeying. A child learned by repeating. The afternoon passed slowly. The heat deepened. Shadows shortened and then began to stretch once more. When the work finally ended, the boy felt exhaustion settle heavily into his body. His legs hurt. His hands were sore. Dust covered his skin. Yet tomorrow would be much the same. And the day after that. And the day after that. This repetition was not unusual. It was life. As father and son walked home, the village gradually returned to motion. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Women prepared evening meals. Children too young for serious labor played in the streets, their laughter carrying softly through the warm air. The boy watched them. Perhaps he remembered when he had spent entire evenings playing games beside the riverbank. Perhaps he remembered running barefoot through dusty paths with few responsibilities beyond returning home before dark. Those days had not vanished completely. But they were becoming distant. At home, his mother prepared bread inside a clay oven. The smell filled the small house with warmth and comfort. His younger siblings sat nearby. One child slept. Another played quietly with carved wooden figures. The boy washed his hands using precious water. Then he sat. His father sat beside him. For a few moments, Nobody spoke. Outside, the sky slowly transformed from gold to orange and then to deep blue. This quiet time at day's end held a special importance. The work had ended. The demands had paused. For a brief period, families simply existed together. The boy listened as his parents discussed crops, neighbors, taxes, and river levels. He understood some of their words and failed to understand others. Yet he listened carefully. Listening itself was another lesson. Children learned when to speak. Children learned when to remain silent. Children learned that adulthood carried worries invisible to younger eyes. Later, after darkness settled fully across the village, lamps flickered softly against mud brick walls. The sounds of work disappeared one by one. A fisherman returned home carrying empty nets. A merchant secured his goods. A potter washed clay from tired hands. Across Egypt, countless ordinary people prepared for sleep. And among them were countless children learning what adulthood would demand. Not all children became farmers. Some entered workshops. There, the lessons were different, but the discipline remained the same. In a crowded workshop near a larger town, another child sat beside a craftsman shaping wood. The room smelled of sawdust and sweat. Sunlight entered through narrow openings in the walls. Tools rested neatly against shelves. The child had spent years simply observing, watching, listening, fetching tools, sweeping floors. Now he was beginning to learn more difficult tasks. His hands were small, his movements uncertain. The craftsman corrected him repeatedly. Not angrily, simply firmly. Again, again, again. Skill emerged through repetition. Patience became its own form of education. Hours passed. The workshop grew hotter. The child continued. Outside, merchants called to customers. Donkeys moved through crowded streets. Bakers removed fresh bread from ovens. Scribes hurried between buildings carrying records and messages. Life continued in every direction. And within that life, children slowly transformed into workers. Some children became scribes. Their education differed from physical labor, yet it required perhaps even greater discipline. Inside a school attached to a temple or government office, young students sat cross-legged with writing materials before them. The room remained quiet except for voices repeating lessons. Again. 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 A teacher walked among them. Mistakes received correction. Sometimes gentle. Sometimes not. The students practiced symbols for hours. Their backs hurt. Their hands cramped. Their eyes grew tired. Yet they continued. Because literacy offered opportunity. Because writing brought status. Because discipline promised a different future. Still, even for these children, growing up remained a long lesson in obedience, endurance, and responsibility. No path was easy. No childhood lasted forever. As darkness deepened over Egypt once more, the villages and cities slowly surrendered to sleep. Families gathered on rooftops beneath stars. The day's heat escaped gradually into the night air. Children listened to stories told by parents and grandparents. Stories of gods, animals, rivers, and ancestors. Stories carried through generations. For a little while, childhood returned. For a little while, responsibilities faded. A boy looked upward. Above him stretched countless stars. The same stars his father had watched. The same stars his grandfather had watched. The same stars that countless children across Egypt had studied before drifting into sleep. Tomorrow, before dawn, the lessons would begin again. The river would continue flowing. The bread would need baking. The fields would require labor. The workshops would fill with sound. And slowly, gently, almost without notice, another day of growing up would pass beneath the quiet skies of ancient Egypt. Long before the first light touched the eastern horizon, the villages beside the Nile had already begun to stir once again. The night never truly belonged to silence. Even in darkness, there were always sounds. The soft breathing of sleeping families. The distant movement of water against reeds. The occasional cry of a bird disturbed in its rest. Somewhere beyond the fields, a donkey shifted its weight and stamped against the earth. A dog lifted its head, listened to the darkness, and settled once more. Inside a small mud brick home, a young girl opened her eyes. The room around her remained dark except for the faint glow of dying embers from the cooking fire. The air was cooler now than it would be in only a few hours. She lay quietly for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of her family sleeping nearby. She already knew what the day would bring. In ancient Egypt, many children did not wake each morning wondering what they would become. Their future often surrounded them from the moment they were born. It lived in their homes, in their parents' hands, in the fields beyond their villages, and in the routines repeated every day. The girl sat up carefully. She wrapped a simple linen cloth around herself and stepped onto the cool floor. Beneath her feet, the packed earth felt smooth from years of use. Outside, the sky remained dark blue, and countless stars still shone above the Nile Valley. Her mother was already awake. She always was. The mother knelt beside a grinding stone, slowly crushing grain into flour. The steady sound of stone against stone filled the quiet room. It was a sound that had greeted mornings in Egypt for thousands of years. The girl sat beside her. No instructions were necessary. She had watched this work since she was old enough to remember. At first, she had simply observed. Then she had carried small baskets. Later, she had learned how to sort grain, clean vessels, prepare fuel for cooking fires, and assist with countless small tasks that adults barely noticed. Growing older often happened this way. Not through a single important moment, but through thousands of ordinary ones. Outside, the horizon slowly brightened. The stars began to disappear. A soft breeze carried the smell of river water and damp earth through the village. Other homes were awakening now. Doors opened. Footsteps sounded along narrow paths. Someone called quietly to a neighbor. The mother and daughter worked without speaking much. Their movements were practiced and calm. The grain became flour. The flour became dough. The dough would soon become bread. Bread was more than food. It was routine. It was comfort. It was survival. The girl's hands moved carefully as she shaped small portions of dough. Her mother watched closely. Occasionally, she corrected the position of a hand or demonstrated a movement once more. The lessons were never dramatic. They were quiet. And because they were quiet, they became part of everyday life. By sunrise, the village had fully awakened. Smoke rose into the morning air from dozens of cooking fires. Children carried jars of water. Men prepared tools for work in the fields. Animals were fed. Doors opened and closed. Voices drifted through the narrow streets. The sun itself appeared slowly above the eastern desert. Its light touched the Nile. Then the palm trees. Then the mud brick homes. And finally the faces of the people beginning another day. For many children in ancient Egypt, growing up meant learning that every hour belonged to someone or something else. The river demanded attention. The crops demanded labor. The family demanded responsibility. The body itself demanded endurance. Very little time remained untouched by obligation. The girl carried freshly baked bread to a nearby storage room. The warm loaves filled the air with a rich, comforting smell. For a moment, she paused. Outside, she could hear younger children playing. Their voices rose and fell in the morning air. They laughed. They chased one another through the dusty paths between houses. She watched them for only a few seconds. Then she returned to work. Not because anyone had ordered her to. Because she understood that this was now expected of her. This understanding often arrived quietly. Children rarely notice the exact day when they stopped being children. Instead, they slowly accepted new responsibilities until those responsibilities simply became life itself. As the morning continued, the heat began its gradual return. The village changed with it. People moved more slowly. Animals sought shade. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads to protect themselves from the sun. The girl joined several other family members on a walk toward the river. The Nile was the center of everything. It provided water, food, transportation, and life itself. Yet reaching the river often required effort. Clay jars were heavy even when empty. They became much heavier when filled. The path toward the water was already crowded. Women balanced jars on their shoulders and heads. Older children carried smaller containers. Men prepared fishing equipment or loaded goods onto boats. The air smelled of wet reeds, mud, fish, and river water warmed by the rising sun. The girl knelt beside the bank. The Nile flowed past her slowly and silently. For a moment, she watched the current. The water had traveled far. It had passed villages she would never see and people she would never know. Yet every person along its banks shared something important. They all depended upon discipline. The jar filled slowly. She lifted it carefully. The weight pressed against her arms and shoulders. She stood. Then she began the walk home. By midday, the heat had become almost unbearable. The streets grew quieter. Many people sought whatever shade they could find. The air itself seemed heavy. Inside homes and workshops, work continued despite the temperature. In one crowded workshop near the center of a larger town, a young apprentice sat beside an older craftsman. The workshop smelled of wood dust and hot air. Small windows allowed only narrow beams of sunlight to enter. Sweat ran down the faces of everyone inside. The sound of tools striking wood echoed through the room with steady rhythm. The apprentice had been here for years. When he first arrived, he had performed the simplest tasks imaginable. Sweeping floors. Carrying tools. Fetching water. Watching. Always watching. Only gradually had he earned the right to participate in the actual work. Even now, he remained under constant observation. The craftsman corrected him frequently. Not because he disliked the boy. Because mistakes cost time. Mistakes wasted materials. Mistakes could affect an entire family's survival. The apprentice understood this. He accepted correction without argument. The lesson was not merely how to shape wood. The lesson was patience. The lesson was humility. The lesson was discipline. Outside the workshop, the afternoon sun covered the city in bright white light. Dust rose beneath the feet of merchants and laborers. Market stalls remained busy despite the heat. Fresh bread, vegetables, fish, and pottery changed hands. Children moved through these crowded spaces carrying goods for their families. Some worked as assistants. Some worked as servants. Some simply followed parents who themselves had no choice but to work. Ancient Egypt was full of children. And almost all of them were learning something. How to farm. How to fish. How to build. How to weave. How to write. How to obey. How to endure. Near the edge of the river, another boy sat beside his grandfather repairing fishing nets. The old man's hands moved slowly but confidently. Years of labor had left them rough and scarred. The boy watched closely. Then he copied the movements. Again. And again. And again. The sun reflected brightly from the water. Birds circled overhead. Small boats drifted along the river current. The grandfather spoke very little. He did not need to. The work itself explained everything. The boy's fingers became tangled in the netting. He made mistakes. He tried again. Eventually, he succeeded. No celebration followed. Success was expected. Tomorrow, he would continue learning. The day after that, he would continue learning again. For many people in ancient Egypt, education never truly ended. Life itself remained the teacher. As afternoon slowly turned toward evening, the heat finally began to loosen its hold. Long shadows stretched across fields and roads. The air became easier to breathe. Workers began returning home. The fisherman carried repaired nets. The apprentice cleaned his workspace. Farmers gathered their tools. Children who had spent the day helping adults walked with tired steps beside them. The village gradually filled with familiar sounds. Cooking fires crackled. Animals called to one another. Neighbors exchanged quiet greetings. Dust hung in the golden evening light. The young girl who had begun her day before sunrise now sat beside her family once again. Her hands ached. Her feet hurt. She was tired in a way that felt deep and heavy. Yet this exhaustion was familiar. Everyone around her carried the same tiredness. Her mother prepared bread and vegetables. Her father returned from labor in the fields. Her younger sibling slowly grew quiet as darkness approached. For a short time, work disappeared. The family simply sat together. The evening breeze entered through the doorway. Outside, the sky transformed into shades of orange and purple. The first stars appeared. These moments were precious. Not because they were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary. For countless families throughout Egypt, this was the reward at the end of every difficult day. A little food. A little conversation. A little rest. Then sleep. As darkness covered the Nile Valley once more, the world became quieter. Boats rested along the riverbank. Markets emptied. Workshops closed. The endless labor of the day finally paused. Families climbed onto rooftops to escape the lingering heat trapped inside their homes. Children lay beside parents and grandparents beneath the stars. Some listened to stories. Others simply listened to the sounds of the night. The young girl looked upward. Above her stretched a sky filled with countless points of light. She wondered, perhaps, what adulthood would feel like. She did not yet understand that she had already begun walking toward it years ago. The lessons had started long before she noticed them. With every loaf of bread. With every trip to the river. With every task completed without complaint. With every tired evening beneath the stars. Growing up in ancient Egypt was rarely marked by a single moment. It happened quietly. Slowly. Patiently. Like the flow of the Nile itself. And somewhere beyond the village, beneath the silver light of the moon, the river continued its endless journey through the darkness, carrying with it another day of lessons, another day of labor, and another small step toward adulthood. The moon remained high above the Nile for much of the night. Its pale light rested gently upon the water, turning the slow-moving river into a ribbon of silver that stretched beyond sight. Palm trees stood motionless against the sky. The mud brick walls of villages held the warmth of the day that had passed, releasing it slowly into the cooler darkness. Most families slept. Some slept inside their homes, where the air remained heavy and still. Others rested on flat rooftops beneath the stars, seeking whatever breeze the night could offer. Children lay beside parents, brothers beside sisters, grandparents close by. The sounds of breathing rose and fell softly in the darkness. For a few precious hours, the demands of the world paused. But even in sleep, tomorrow was already approaching. Long before sunrise, a faint gray light appeared in the eastern sky. The stars began to fade one by one. Somewhere near the riverbank, a bird called out. Another answered. Soon, throughout the villages of ancient Egypt, another day of lessons would begin. For children growing up beside the Nile, discipline was rarely taught through long explanations. Instead, it was woven into every hour of daily life, becoming so familiar that it almost disappeared. A young boy sleeping on a rooftop opened his eyes. The woven mat beneath him felt rough against his skin. Above him, the last stars still shone. Around him, his family remained asleep. He listened. The village was waking. A door opened below. Someone coughed. The quiet scraping sound of grain being ground against stone drifted through the cool morning air. He sat up. His body already knew what to do. He folded his blanket. He climbed down from the rooftop. He washed his face with cool water from a clay jar. No one had to remind him. This was part of growing older. The lessons became habits. And habits became life. Outside, dawn spread slowly across the Nile Valley. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke from the first cooking fires. The river reflected the growing light. Fishermen prepared their boats in silence. Farmers lifted tools onto their shoulders. The boy's father stood waiting. He nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. Together they began walking toward the fields. The road beneath their sandals was already warm from countless footsteps. Dust rose gently around them. Other workers joined the path, moving quietly through the pale morning light. The boy had made this walk hundreds of times before. Yet every day, it felt slightly different. Some mornings brought cool breezes from the river. Other mornings promised unbearable heat. Some mornings arrived with the sound of birds. Others arrived in complete silence. But the destination remained the same. The fields. The work. The lesson. The Nile had always given life to Egypt. But it demanded effort in return. Water channels needed repair. Soil required preparation. Crops had to be planted, maintained, harvested, and stored. Every season brought different responsibilities, yet none brought rest for very long. As they reached the fields, the first rays of sunlight touched the earth. The air still felt pleasant. That would not last. The father examined an irrigation channel. Part of its wall had collapsed. He looked at his son. The boy already understood. Without speaking, they began working. The mud was cool beneath their hands. Water moved slowly through the channel. Birds searched nearby for insects disturbed by the labor. At first, the work felt manageable. Then the sun climbed higher. The shadows grew shorter. The coolness disappeared. Soon, sweat covered their skin. The boy's shoulders began to ache. His hands became sore. Yet he continued. Not because he enjoyed the labor. Not because anyone rewarded him. He continued because stopping was not considered an option. This lesson existed everywhere in ancient Egypt. Endurance was expected. Patience was expected. Discipline was expected. Even among the wealthier families who employed servants and laborers, children learned early that their actions reflected upon their households. They learned proper behavior, proper speech, proper duties. For poorer families, the lessons were often even more direct. Work could not wait. The sun did not care about exhaustion. The river did not care about complaints. The crops certainly did not care. As morning slowly turned toward midday, the heat became heavy enough to feel almost solid. The air shimmered above the fields. The distant landscape appeared blurred. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads and continued their labor. The boy paused only briefly to drink water from a clay vessel. The water was warm. Still, it brought relief. He sat beside his father beneath the narrow shade of a palm tree. For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence itself felt comforting. In ancient Egypt, many fathers spoke to their children through action rather than words. A father who worked through exhaustion taught endurance. A father who returned every day taught responsibility. A father who endured hardship without complaint taught discipline. The boy watched his father's hands. They were rough, scarred, darkened by years beneath the sun. One day, he understood, his own hands would look the same. The thought did not frighten him. It simply felt true. After their brief rest, they returned to work. The sun remained high overhead. Time itself seemed to slow beneath the heat. Elsewhere, throughout Egypt, other children faced different lessons. In a crowded town along the river, a young apprentice scribe sat cross-legged inside a small room. The air was warm and still. Sunlight entered through narrow windows, creating bright shapes upon the floor. Before him lay sheets of papyrus. Beside him sat other students. All were quiet. At the front of the room stood their instructor. The lesson had already continued for hours. The boys carefully copied symbols. Again. And again. And again. Their hands cramped. Their backs hurt. Their eyes grew tired. Mistakes required correction. Corrections required repetition. Repetition required patience. For these students, discipline lived not in physical labor, but in concentration. A wandering mind created errors. Errors wasted precious materials. So they learned to control themselves. To sit quietly. To focus. To continue. Outside, beyond the walls of the school, the city remained alive with movement. Merchants sold grain and cloth. Builders carried stone. Bakers worked beside hot ovens. Servants transported water. Animals moved slowly through crowded streets. The sounds of labor filled the air. But inside the schoolroom, only the scratching of reeds against papyrus could be heard. One young student blinked heavily. He had risen before dawn. He had walked through the city streets in darkness. He had studied for hours. And still, the day was far from over. Growing up in ancient Egypt often meant learning how to continue despite fatigue. Fatigue itself became familiar. Children learned to carry it. Adults learned to live with it. By afternoon, the heat spread everywhere. In workshops. In homes. In markets. In fields. Along the riverbanks. A young girl walked carefully through her village carrying a heavy basket of freshly baked bread. The basket pressed against her arms. Dust clung to her feet. The sunlight reflected brightly from whitewashed walls. She moved slowly but steadily. She had already spent the morning grinding grain, preparing dough, tending the cooking fire, and helping care for younger children. Now another task awaited. Then another. Then another. Childhood responsibilities often arrived one at a time. But over the years, they accumulated. Until eventually, responsibility itself became the shape of daily life. She passed older women weaving cloth beneath a shaded awning. Their hands moved with remarkable speed. She passed laborers returning from river work. Their faces shone with sweat. She passed younger children chasing one another through the dust. Their laughter echoed between houses. She watched them briefly. Then she continued walking. Perhaps she remembered when her own days had contained more play. Perhaps she did not. Memory itself changes with time. The basket remained heavy. The sun remained hot. The road remained long. Near the river, fishermen prepared to return from the day's labor. Their boats moved slowly across the water. Nets lay piled beside them. Some boats carried fish. Others carried very little. The Nile provided much. But it never guaranteed success. One fisherman sat beside his son as they repaired damaged netting. The father worked slowly. The son copied each movement. The lesson required no explanation. The father had learned from his own father. And one day, the son would teach another child. This was how discipline traveled through generations. Not through books. Not through speeches. Through repetition. Through observation. Through daily life itself. As the sun finally began its descent toward the western horizon, relief slowly arrived. The air remained warm, but the unbearable heat weakened. Shadows lengthened across the fields. Birds returned to the riverbanks. Workers began gathering their tools. The day, at last, was ending. The boy from the fields walked home beside his father. Both were tired. Their sandals stirred dust along the road. Around them, other families made the same journey. No one moved quickly. There was no need. Evening had its own rhythm. Smoke rose from cooking fires. The smell of bread drifted through the village. Somewhere nearby, someone played a simple melody on a reed instrument. Children carried water. Mothers prepared meals. Grandparents rested outside their homes, enjoying the cooler air. The boy felt exhaustion settle heavily inside his body. Yet there was comfort in this feeling. The work was finished. At least for today. He entered his home. The familiar smells surrounded him. Bread. Smoke. Clay. Warm air. Family. He sat quietly beside his parents. No one spoke much. They did not need to. They had all lived the same day. Different tasks. Different burdens. The same exhaustion. Outside, darkness slowly returned to the Nile Valley. The sky deepened from orange to purple and finally to black. One by one, stars appeared. Families climbed onto rooftops. Children lay beside parents. The air became cooler. Somewhere far away, a boat moved silently along the river beneath the moonlight. The boy looked upward. The stars seemed endless. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough. The fields would wait. The workshops would wait. The schools would wait. The lessons would continue. And beneath the quiet sky of ancient Egypt, surrounded by the soft sounds of the night, another child slowly drifted toward sleep, carrying with him the long, patient lessons of growing up. As the night deepened over the Nile Valley, the world seemed to grow larger and quieter at the same time. The river flowed through the darkness with the same patient rhythm it had followed for thousands of years. Moonlight rested upon its surface. Reeds swayed gently along the banks. The distant calls of water birds rose briefly into the air and then faded back into silence. On the flat rooftops of villages and towns, families slept beneath the open sky. The heat trapped inside mud-brick homes slowly escaped into the night. Children lay wrapped in light linen cloths. Parents rested beside them. Grandparents, whose bodies had known many decades of labor, slept deeply after another long day. Above them all stretched a sky filled with stars. For many children in ancient Egypt, these quiet hours of darkness were the only moments when no one expected anything from them. No tools had to be carried. No water jars needed lifting. No grain required grinding. No lessons needed memorizing. For a little while, there was only the night air, the distant sound of the Nile, and the comforting presence of family nearby. Yet even as they slept, the next day's responsibilities waited patiently. Long before sunrise, the first sounds of waking returned. A rooster called somewhere beyond the village. A donkey shifted against its tether. A woman opened the wooden door of her home and stepped into the cool darkness carrying an empty water jar. The stars had not yet disappeared. The world existed in that quiet space between night and morning. Inside one small house near the river, a boy of perhaps 12 years old sat up slowly on his sleeping mat. His body hurt. Not from injury. Simply from living. His shoulders ached from carrying baskets. His hands remained sore from field work. The muscles in his legs felt heavy. He had become accustomed to this feeling. In many ways, learning to live with discomfort was one of the first lessons of adulthood. The boy listened to his father moving outside. The day had already begun. He rose. The floor beneath his feet still held the coolness of the night. He splashed water onto his face from a clay basin. The water was cold enough to wake him fully. Outside, the village remained quiet. The eastern horizon showed only the faintest hint of light. Father and son walked together toward the river. They carried fishing nets across their shoulders. The path felt familiar beneath their sandals. They had walked this road hundreds of times before. The air smelled of damp earth and river reeds. Small insects drifted through the darkness. Ahead, the Nile appeared almost black beneath the fading stars. At the riverbank, several other fishermen were already preparing their boats. Nobody spoke loudly. There was no need. Everyone understood the importance of these early hours. Fish were easier to catch before the sun climbed high into the sky. The boy climbed carefully into the small boat. His father untied the rope securing it to the shore. The current gently pulled them away from land. For a few moments, neither spoke. The sound of water touching the wooden boat was enough. The boy looked back toward the village. From the river, the homes appeared small and quiet. Thin streams of smoke were beginning to rise from cooking fires. The silhouettes of palm trees stood motionless against the slowly brightening horizon. The world felt peaceful. But peace did not mean rest. The father handed the boy part of the fishing net. He accepted it immediately. This was another lesson. Not one learned from words. One learned from repetition. The net moved through the air. It landed upon the water. Then they waited. Patience was another skill children learned early. There was little choice. Farming required patience. Fishing required patience. Craftsmanship required patience. Even childhood itself required patience. The boat drifted slowly. Birds began calling overhead. The sky changed from black to blue, and then to pale gold. Eventually, the father nodded. Together, they pulled the net. The ropes cut into the boy's hands. His muscles tightened. The net emerged slowly from the water. Some mornings, the catch was good. Some mornings, it was not. Today, several fish glimmered in the morning light. The boy felt satisfaction. Not excitement. Not pride. Simply satisfaction. The work had succeeded. For now. As the sun rose higher, the coolness disappeared. The familiar heat returned. The river reflected the sunlight so brightly that the boy narrowed his eyes. Around them, other boats moved across the water. Each carried families. Each carried responsibilities. Each carried children learning how to become adults. By late morning, they returned to shore. The fish would be sold. The nets would need repair. Tomorrow, they would return again. There was always another day of work waiting. Back in the village, life had fully awakened. Women baked bread beside clay ovens. The smell drifted through narrow streets. Children carried water jars from the river. Merchants prepared goods for market. Builders lifted stone. Farmers walked toward distant fields. Everywhere, movement. Everywhere, routine. A young girl sat beside her grandmother beneath a shaded shelter. Before them rested baskets of flax fibers. The grandmother's hands moved carefully and precisely. The girl's movements remained slower. She watched closely. Then she copied. Again. And again. And again. The fibers became thread. The thread would become cloth. The cloth would become clothing. Every object in ancient Egypt carried the memory of labor. Every piece of bread. Every woven basket. Every fishing net. Every linen garment. Behind each stood countless hours of patient work. The grandmother paused. She adjusted the girl's hands. Then they continued. No frustration. No praise. Simply continuation. The girl had begun learning these skills years earlier. At first, she had played nearby while adults worked. Then she had watched. Then she had helped. Now she was expected to contribute. This transition happened so gradually that few children could identify when it occurred. One season, they were observers. Another season, they had become workers. As the day grew hotter, shadows became precious. Animals gathered beneath trees. People sought shelter beneath awnings and walls. Even the wind seemed to disappear. In a crowded workshop farther north along the Nile, a young apprentice stone worker wiped sweat from his forehead. Dust covered his skin. Tiny fragments of limestone clung to his clothing. Around him, experienced craftsmen continued their labor. The sounds of hammers striking stone echoed endlessly through the workshop. The apprentice had arrived several years earlier. At first, he had believed that stone carving involved strength. He later learned that it required something much more difficult. Patience. Every movement mattered. Every mistake remained visible. Stone remembered errors. So the apprentice learned to slow his hands. To observe. To repeat. To endure. The master craftsman approached. He examined the apprentice's work. He frowned slightly. Then he demonstrated the correct technique. Once. Only once. The apprentice nodded. Then he began again. In ancient Egypt, correction was part of growing up. Children were corrected by parents. Apprentices were corrected by masters. Students were corrected by teachers. The lesson beneath every correction remained the same. Continue. Try again. Improve. Endure. Outside, the afternoon heat spread across the land. The air shimmered above roads and rooftops. Dust drifted through sunlight. Somewhere, a child cried from exhaustion. Somewhere else, another child carried water despite tired arms. Life continued. It always continued. As afternoon slowly surrendered to evening, the world softened once more. Workers returned home. The light became golden. Long shadows stretched across the earth. The heat began to loosen its grip. Along the Nile, fishermen repaired nets. Farmers cleaned tools. Women prepared evening meals. Children completed their final tasks of the day. The boy who had spent the morning fishing sat outside his home. His father worked quietly beside him, repairing torn netting. The boy copied each movement. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The silence between them contained years of lessons. Nearby, the smell of fresh bread drifted through the village. Smoke rose into the evening sky. Birds returned to their nests. The world itself seemed to grow tired. Eventually, darkness returned. Families gathered together. Meals were shared. Stories were told softly. Younger children fell asleep before the conversations ended. Older children listened quietly. They listened because listening itself was another lesson. Adults spoke of river levels, harvests, illness, taxes, weather, responsibilities. Children learned that adulthood was not simply about becoming older. It was about carrying burdens. Some burdens were physical. Others lived quietly inside the mind. Later, after the final lamps had been extinguished, families climbed once more onto their rooftops. The night air felt cool against tired skin. The stars returned. The Nile continued its endless journey through the darkness. The boy lay beside his family. His muscles still ached from the day's labor. His hands remained rough. Tomorrow, he would wake before sunrise again. Tomorrow, there would be nets. There would be work. There would be lessons. But for now, beneath the ancient sky and beside the patient river, he allowed his eyes to close. And all across Egypt, countless other children did the same, carrying with them the quiet understanding that growing up was not a single moment, but 1,000 ordinary days woven together beneath the sun and stars of the Nile Valley. The night breeze moved gently across the rooftops of the Nile Valley. It carried with it the scent of river water, distant cooking fires that had long since faded, and the dry smell of earth that had spent the entire day beneath the sun. The stars overhead remained bright and countless. Their light had guided travelers, farmers, fishermen, and merchants for generations beyond memory. For a little while longer, the world remained asleep. The river continued its endless journey through the darkness. The palm trees remained still. The villages rested. Yet beneath the silence, another day was already waiting. As the eastern sky slowly changed from black to deep blue, the first sounds of morning returned once again. A bird called from the reeds near the riverbank. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden door creaked open. Footsteps crossed packed earth. In one village south of a great temple city, a young boy woke before anyone called his name. He was perhaps 13 years old. The cool night air still lingered around him as he sat upright on the rooftop where his family had slept. Around him, his younger brothers remained asleep beneath light linen coverings. His father was already gone. The boy knew where he would be. At the animals. There was always work to do before sunrise. He stood carefully and looked eastward. The horizon glowed softly. Beyond the fields and villages, beyond the distant line of desert hills, the sun was preparing to rise again. He descended the narrow staircase leading into the family home. The walls still held the coolness of the night. A small oil lamp flickered weakly in the corner. His mother was already awake, preparing the morning meal. She nodded. He nodded back. No words were necessary. Outside, the village was emerging slowly from darkness. The air smelled of dust, smoke, and damp earth. Nearby, a donkey shifted impatiently. Chickens scratched at the ground. A few older men were already walking toward the river carrying fishing equipment. The boy crossed the village and reached a small enclosure where several goats and a pair of cattle waited. His father was there. He was repairing part of a wooden fence damaged during the night. The boy picked up a tool. Again, nothing needed to be said. This too was part of growing up. One day, children stopped waiting for instructions. They simply understood what needed to be done. The father glanced briefly at his son. There was no smile. But there was approval. Not spoken. Simply understood. As dawn spread across the Nile Valley, the world slowly filled with color. The river became gold. The fields turned green. The mud brick homes reflected the soft light of morning. Workers emerged from every direction. Some carried tools. Some carried baskets. Some carried water jars balanced carefully against their shoulders. Children walked among them. Not as visitors. Not as observers. As participants. In ancient Egypt, there was little separation between childhood and adult life. Children did not spend years preparing for responsibility while remaining separate from it. They lived inside responsibility from the beginning. The boy and his father led the animals toward a grazing area near the river. The ground was still cool beneath their sandals. Birds flew low over the water. A gentle breeze moved through the reeds. For a few moments, before the heat arrived, the world felt peaceful. The boy enjoyed these moments. He never spoke about them. Perhaps he never even fully recognized them. But he felt them. The cool air. The sound of moving water. The quiet companionship of his father walking beside him. These small moments of peace existed between long hours of labor. They became precious because they never lasted. As the sun climbed higher, the village behind them disappeared into the brightness of the day. The boy spent hours watching the animals. At first glance, the work seemed simple. But simple work often required great attention. Animals wandered. They became sick. They fought. They escaped. The boy had learned to watch carefully. To remain patient. To anticipate problems before they appeared. These were lessons that adults valued deeply. Not because they created comfort. Because they created survival. Farther north, in a busy town near the Nile, another child was learning different lessons. A young girl sat beside her mother inside a weaving workshop. The room was crowded. The air was warm. Sunlight entered through small openings near the ceiling, creating narrow beams that illuminated floating dust. The sounds inside the workshop blended together into a constant rhythm. The movement of looms. The soft conversations of workers. The creaking of wood. The rustling of flax fibers. The girl had spent years inside this room. As a small child, she had played beneath the looms. Later, she had carried thread. Now she sat at the loom herself. Her fingers moved carefully. The work demanded concentration. Mistakes wasted valuable materials. Mistakes required additional labor. The older women around her worked with remarkable speed. Their hands seemed to move almost automatically. Years of repetition had transformed difficult work into habit. The girl watched them. She copied them. She tried to become like them. This was another lesson of growing up. To observe those who had already endured what lay ahead. To learn by watching. To accept that mastery required years. Outside, the sun rose higher. Heat spread through the streets. Merchants called to customers. Builders transported stone. Donkeys carried grain. Servants moved quickly between homes and markets. Everywhere, labor. Everywhere, routine. In another part of Egypt, a young apprentice worked beside masons repairing a temple wall. Dust filled the air. Stone fragments covered the ground. The apprentice carried tools, cleaned surfaces, and observed the movements of experienced workers. His shoulders hurt. His feet hurt. His hands were covered with small cuts. Yet he continued. Every day, he continued. He had learned something important. Adults respected endurance. Not complaints. Not excuses. Endurance. So he endured. As the afternoon heat settled heavily over the land, work slowed but never stopped completely. In villages along the Nile, families retreated briefly into whatever shade they could find. Mud brick walls provided some relief. Palm trees provided a little more. The boy tending animals sat beneath a tree near the riverbank. He removed his sandals. The ground beneath the shade felt cool. For a few moments, he simply listened. The Nile moved quietly. Insects hummed. Birds called from distant reeds. Nearby, one of the cattle rested in the shade. The boy closed his eyes. Not to sleep. Only to rest. He thought about little. Exhaustion often left little room for thought. Yet somewhere inside him, another lesson was taking shape. Growing older did not always mean becoming stronger. Sometimes it meant becoming accustomed. Accustomed to heat. Accustomed to fatigue. Accustomed to responsibility. Accustomed to continuing. After a short time, he stood again. The work resumed. The sun continued its journey westward. Hours passed. Shadows slowly lengthened. The terrible heat began to loosen its hold. Across Egypt, countless children experienced the same relief. The apprentice put down his tools. The girl left the weaving room. The students in scribal schools rolled their papyrus sheets and stretched their aching backs. Farmers gathered their equipment. Fishermen repaired their nets. The day was ending. The world softened. Evening in ancient Egypt carried a different feeling than morning. Morning belonged to duty. Evening belonged to survival. If one reached evening, the day's labor had been endured. Families began returning home. Dust rose beneath tired feet. The smell of cooking fires filled the air. Bread baked in clay ovens. Stew simmered slowly. Children carried the final jars of water for the day. The boy returned with his father and the animals. Both walked slowly. Neither spoke much. The village before them glowed beneath the golden light of sunset. Smoke drifted upward. Voices echoed softly between homes. Somewhere, someone laughed. Somewhere else, a baby cried. Life continued. As it always had. At home, the family gathered for their evening meal. bread, vegetables, perhaps fish, perhaps dates. The food was simple. Yet after a day of labor, it tasted good. They ate quietly. Conversation came slowly. Everyone was tired. Even the youngest children seemed quieter as darkness approached. After the meal, the boy climbed once more onto the rooftop. The heat of the day still lingered in the stone beneath his feet. He sat beside his grandfather. The old man looked toward the river. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, the grandfather pointed toward the stars. The boy followed his gaze. Above them stretched the same sky that had watched countless generations grow old. The grandfather had once been a boy carrying water. He had once worked beneath the same sun. He had once learned the same lessons. One day, the boy understood, he too would become an old man remembering his own childhood. And perhaps he would realize something that children rarely understand. That growing up does not happen quickly. It happens one morning at a time. One task at a time. One season at a time. One tired evening beneath the stars at a time. The night deepened around them. The village grew quiet. The Nile continued to flow through the darkness. And beneath the ancient sky, surrounded by family and softened by exhaustion, another day of learning how to become an adult gently came to an end. The night settled deeply over the Nile Valley. The last cooking fires faded into glowing embers. Voices that had drifted through the village after sunset slowly disappeared. One by one, families finished their evening meals, climbed onto their rooftops, and lay down beneath the open sky. Above them, the stars seemed endless. The people of ancient Egypt knew these stars well. They appeared every night above the river, above the fields, above the temples and villages and workshops. Children grew up watching them. Parents grew old beneath them. Generations passed while the stars remained unchanged. A warm breeze moved slowly across the rooftops. It carried the smell of river reeds, dry earth, and distant water. A young girl lay awake beside her younger sister. Everyone else had fallen asleep. Her mother breathed quietly nearby. Her father, exhausted from a day of labor, slept deeply. Even the dogs in the street below had grown silent. The girl looked upward. Tomorrow would be another day of work. She knew this with certainty. There would be grain to grind. There would be water to carry. There would be bread to prepare. There would be younger children to watch. At some point in her childhood, she had stopped asking when the work would end. The work did not end. It simply changed. This was one of the quiet truths of growing up in ancient Egypt. A child first learned to carry a small basket. Then a larger basket. A child first learned to fetch a small jar of water. Then a heavier one. A child first learned to observe. Then to assist. Then to perform the task alone. Responsibility arrived slowly enough that few people noticed its arrival. Eventually, the girl closed her eyes. The sounds of the Nile drifted through the darkness. And somewhere between exhaustion and sleep, another day came to an end. Before long, another began. The first light of dawn spread across the eastern horizon. The stars faded. The air remained cool, but only barely. In the villages beside the river, movement returned. Doors opened. Footsteps sounded. Clay vessels touched stone floors. The same routines that had been repeated for generations began once more. The girl woke before sunrise. She sat up quietly and wrapped her linen garment around herself. The rooftop beneath her still held a little of the night's coolness. For a brief moment, she remained seated. The sky above her had turned a soft shade of blue. Birds had begun singing near the riverbank. The world felt peaceful. This peacefulness would not last long. But perhaps that was why people valued it. She climbed down into the house. Inside, her mother had already lit the cooking fire. The room smelled of smoke and grain. Without speaking, the girl sat beside the grinding stone. She placed grain into the hollow. Then she began to work. Forward. Back. Forward. Back. The sound filled the room. Stone against stone. Again. And again. And again. The movement required strength. Not great strength. But enough. Enough to make her shoulders ache. Enough to tire her arms. Enough that, by the end of the morning, she would feel the labor in every muscle. Still, she continued. Outside, the village grew louder. Children called to one another. Animals moved through the streets. Men prepared tools. Women carried baskets. The sun rose slowly above the horizon. Its light touched the tops of the palm trees. Then the rooftops. Then the dusty roads themselves. Soon, the cool air disappeared. The heat returned. In another village farther down the Nile, a boy walked beside his older brother toward the fields. The boy was 11. His brother was 17. The 6 years between them felt much larger than 6 years. The older brother already moved like a man. His shoulders were broader. His hands were rougher. His face carried the quiet seriousness of someone who had worked for many seasons. The younger boy watched him carefully. Older siblings often became teachers. Not through lessons. Through example. The older brother carried a heavy wooden tool across his shoulders. The younger boy carried a lighter one. Someday, the heavier tool would become his. For now, he walked. The road stretched beside irrigation canals. The water reflected the brightening sky. Birds moved through the reeds. The air smelled of wet earth and growing crops. The younger boy remembered playing here when he was very small. He remembered chasing insects along the riverbank. He remembered throwing stones into the water. Those memories felt distant now. Not because much time had passed. Because he had changed. Childhood often disappeared quietly. One responsibility at a time. When they reached the fields, the other workers had already begun. Men stood ankle-deep in mud repairing irrigation channels. Others inspected crops. Some loaded baskets onto donkeys. No one stood still. The younger boy joined his brother. The work required them to clear debris from a canal. At first, the task seemed simple. But simple work often lasted the longest. The sun climbed. The air grew hotter. Mud clung to their feet. Sweat covered their skin. Still, they continued. The younger boy's arms began to ache. He glanced toward his brother. The older boy kept working. He did not complain. He did not rest. He simply continued. The younger boy returned to his own task. This too was a lesson. Not spoken. Observed. Throughout Egypt, countless children learned in exactly this way. A young apprentice potter learned by watching his master shape clay. A fisherman learned by watching his father repair nets. A young girl learned by watching her mother bake bread. A future scribe learned by watching older students copy symbols onto papyrus. Observation became habit. Habit became skill. Skill became adulthood. As the morning passed, the heat spread across the Nile Valley. The air grew heavy. Shadows became shorter. The world itself seemed to move more slowly. In a crowded town market, a young servant carried baskets of dates from one stall to another. The market smelled of spices, fish, dust, sweat, and fresh bread. Voices echoed from every direction. Merchants called out prices. Animals cried. Children ran between adults. The servant moved carefully through the crowd. The basket felt heavy. He shifted it from one arm to the other. Then back again. He had been carrying things for as long as he could remember. At first, small baskets. Now large ones. One day, perhaps, he would own a stall himself. Or perhaps not. In ancient Egypt, many children grew up understanding something difficult. Hard work did not always change one's place in life. But hard work remained necessary nonetheless. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. The air shimmered above the streets. People searched for shade wherever they could find it. In the fields, workers rested briefly beneath trees. In workshops, craftsmen paused to drink water. In homes, families retreated from the sun. The younger boy sat beside his older brother beneath a palm tree. Their meal was simple. Bread, onions, a few dates, water carried in a clay jar. They ate quietly. The younger boy looked toward the Nile. The river glimmered in the distance. Even from here, he could hear birds. For a moment, he forgot about the work. For a moment, he simply watched the water. Then his brother stood. The rest was over. The work resumed. This, too, was a lesson. Rest was precious because it was temporary. As afternoon slowly stretched across the land, fatigue settled into every village, every workshop, every field. The young girl who had spent the morning grinding grain now carried water from the river. The apprentice potter cleaned tools. The servant returned to the market. The fishermen repaired damaged nets. The students in scribal schools practiced their symbols one final time. The day seemed endless. Yet eventually, as all days do, it began to soften. The sun moved westward. The shadows lengthened. The air became easier to breathe. Birds returned to the riverbanks. The light turned golden. Workers began the slow journey home. The younger boy walked beside his older brother once again. Neither spoke much. Their bodies were too tired. Dust covered their feet. Their clothes smelled of mud and sweat. Yet there was comfort in returning home. Ahead, smoke rose from cooking fires. The village glowed in the evening light. Children too young for labor still played in the streets. Their laughter echoed softly. The younger boy listened. He remembered those days. Not with sadness. Simply with recognition. They belonged to another part of life. As darkness slowly returned to the Nile Valley, families gathered once more. Bread was shared. Stories were told quietly. The stars appeared overhead. And across ancient Egypt, countless children drifted toward sleep carrying the same invisible lesson they had carried all day. That growing up was not a journey toward freedom. It was a patient education in responsibility, endurance, and the quiet acceptance of tomorrow's work. The stars remained overhead long after the villages had fallen silent. Along the Nile, the night possessed its own rhythm. Water moved against the riverbanks with a soft and steady sound. Reeds whispered whenever the breeze passed through them. Occasionally, the cry of a distant bird drifted across the darkness and then disappeared again. For the people of ancient Egypt, these sounds were familiar companions. A child who grew up beside the Nile learned them before learning words. A farmer heard them after returning from the fields. A fisherman heard them while repairing nets beneath the moonlight. An old man heard them while remembering the many years that had already passed. And so, beneath the stars, another night slowly unfolded. In a village not far from a great bend in the river, a young apprentice builder lay awake on a rooftop beside his family. He was 14 years old. His body was tired in the deep and ordinary way that comes from long days of labor. His hands were rough. Fine dust from cut stone still remained beneath his fingernails despite washing. He listened to his younger brother's breathing. He listened to the distant river. Tomorrow, he would return to the construction site. He already knew what the day would feel like. The weight of stone. The brightness of the sun. The ache in his shoulders. The thirst. He closed his eyes. Sleep arrived quickly. It often did for those who worked from sunrise until sunset. Before long, the eastern sky began to change once again. Darkness softened into deep blue. The stars disappeared one at a time. Morning returned. The apprentice opened his eyes before anyone called his name. He no longer needed to be awakened. That, too, was part of growing older. When he was very young, his mother had shaken his shoulder each morning. Later, his father had called for him from outside. Now his body understood the hour. He rose quietly. The rooftop still felt cool beneath his feet. For a brief moment, he stood looking toward the horizon. The Nile reflected the first pale light of dawn. The air smelled fresh. It was perhaps the most peaceful moment of the day. Then he climbed down. Inside the house, his mother handed him a piece of bread. He ate slowly. His father was already preparing tools. The two exchanged only a few words. Not because they disliked speaking. Because there was little need. The day ahead was already understood. Together, they walked toward the construction site. The road passed through fields and along irrigation channels. Other workers joined them. Some carried hammers. Some carried ropes. Others balanced baskets on their shoulders. No one hurried. The day would be long enough without rushing. As the sun rose higher, the world around them changed. The coolness disappeared. The earth began to warm. Birds moved above the river. The sounds of labor slowly filled the air. The construction site itself stood near the edge of a growing town. Large stones rested in orderly rows. Wooden scaffolding reached upward. Workers moved carefully through clouds of dust. The apprentice had spent years here. At first, he had only watched. Then he had carried tools. Later, he had mixed mortar. Now he was beginning to learn how to shape stone itself. The work demanded strength. But strength alone was never enough. It required patience. It required attention. It required discipline. The master builder approached. He examined a block of limestone. Then he looked at the apprentice. Without speaking, he pointed to a section of the stone. The apprentice understood. He lifted his tools. He began to work. The sound of stone being shaped echoed through the morning air. Tap. 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 Again. 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 The movements had to be careful. A mistake could not easily be undone. Stone remembered every error. This was another lesson that children learned while growing up. Some mistakes disappeared quickly. Others remained for a very long time. As the morning passed, the heat spread across the land. Dust settled on skin and clothing. Sweat ran into eyes. The apprentice continued. Nearby, older workers continued. No one complained. Not because the work was easy. Because everyone expected difficulty. This expectation itself was part of life. Far away, in a village along a smaller branch of the Nile, a young girl spent the morning beside her grandmother. Together, they prepared flax fibers. The fibers would eventually become thread. The thread would become cloth. The cloth would become clothing worn by people they would never meet. The grandmother's hands moved slowly now. Age had changed them. They were still skilled. Still precise. But slower. The girl noticed this. She had begun noticing many things lately. How her grandmother paused more often. How her father returned home more tired than before. How her mother rested quietly after carrying water. Growing up often meant seeing the hidden effort in the lives of adults. As a small child, work had seemed natural. Now she understood its cost. The room where they worked was warm. Dust floated in narrow beams of sunlight. Outside, she could hear children playing in the street. Their voices rose and fell in the distance. She listened for a moment. Then she returned to her task. Her grandmother nodded. The lesson continued. By midday, the heat had become heavy and unrelenting. The streets emptied. Animals sought shade. Workers rested wherever they could. At the construction site, the apprentice builder sat beneath a rough shelter made of cloth and wood. He drank water from a clay vessel. The water was warm. Still, it felt precious. He looked around him. The older workers sat silently. Their faces were marked by years spent beneath the Egyptian sun. Some closed their eyes. Some ate bread. Some simply sat and listened to the wind. The apprentice realized something. No one ever spoke about becoming an adult. No ceremony had announced his arrival. No celebration had marked the change. Instead, adulthood had approached quietly. It had arrived through mornings spent working. Through evenings spent exhausted. Through responsibilities accepted one after another. He had become older without noticing. Perhaps everyone did. After a short rest, the work resumed. The afternoon passed slowly. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows lengthened. The stone remained heavy. The dust remained everywhere. Yet the day, like all days, eventually began to end. Throughout Egypt, workers started their journeys home. Farmers gathered tools. Fishermen tied their boats. Merchants counted goods. Scribes rolled their papyrus sheets. Children who had spent the day learning adult responsibilities walked beside adults who had spent their lives carrying them. The apprentice builder walked home with his father. Their sandals stirred dust along the road. The air had cooled slightly. The sun hung low above the western horizon. The light became soft and golden. Around them, the Nile Valley seemed to exhale after a long day. Birds returned to the reeds. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Voices drifted through the evening air. When they reached the village, the apprentice's younger brothers ran through the street, laughing as they chased one another. He watched them. He remembered doing the same. Not so long ago. And yet it felt very far away. His father noticed. For a moment, both watched the children play. Neither spoke. No words were needed. They both understood. Childhood was brief. Not because the years themselves were short, but because responsibility arrived so early. That evening, after bread had been shared and the day's heat had faded, the apprentice climbed once more onto the rooftop. The stars had returned. The Nile glimmered in the darkness. A cool breeze moved gently across his face. His body ached. His hands hurt. Tomorrow would bring another day of labor. Another day of lessons. Another day of becoming someone older than he had been the day before. He lay down beside his family. Above him, the stars remained patient and unchanged. And somewhere in the darkness, the Nile continued its endless journey, carrying with it the memories of countless children who had grown up beneath the same sky, learned the same lessons, and slowly, quietly, become adults. The Nile flowed through the darkness as it always had. Long after the villages had fallen asleep, long after the cooking fires had faded into ash, and long after the sounds of conversation had disappeared, the river remained awake. Its waters moved patiently northward beneath the stars, reflecting the moonlight in soft, broken patterns. The people who lived beside the Nile depended upon its constancy. Children learned this early. The river rose. The river fell. The crops grew. The crops failed. The seasons changed. And through it all, life continued. On a rooftop near the edge of a farming village, a young boy dreamed. He dreamed not of kings or temples or distant lands. He dreamed of running. In the dream, he was younger. He ran barefoot along the riverbank, chasing birds that lifted suddenly into the sky. The air was cool. The water glittered beside him. No one called his name. No one asked him to carry anything or repair anything or remember anything. Then, slowly, the dream dissolved. The sound of footsteps below woke him. Morning had arrived. For a few moments, he remained still. The stars were disappearing. The air still carried the coolness of the night. He listened to the sounds around him. His father was already outside. His mother was preparing bread. A donkey brayed somewhere in the village. Another day had begun. The boy sat up and rubbed his eyes. He was 15 now. Old enough that few people still referred to him as a child. Yet in many ways, he still felt like one. Perhaps everyone did. Growing older did not always feel like becoming someone different. Sometimes it felt like carrying more and more of the same things. More work. More responsibility. More expectations. He climbed down from the rooftop. The packed earth floor felt cool beneath his feet. The smell of baking bread filled the small house. His mother handed him a piece. He thanked her quietly. Outside, dawn spread across the Nile Valley. The light touched the tops of the date palms first. Then the irrigation canals. Then the fields stretching toward the horizon. The boy picked up a wooden hoe. Its handle felt smooth from years of use. His father stood waiting near the doorway. Together, they began walking. The road to the fields was familiar. They had walked it in darkness. They had walked it in rain. They had walked it during harvest and during planting. The boy could have followed it with his eyes closed. As they walked, other workers joined them. Some spoke softly. Others remained silent. The silence never felt uncomfortable. Everyone was saving their strength. The day would require it. When they reached the fields, the earth still held some moisture from the night. This made the work easier. For a little while, the boy began clearing weeds from between rows of crops. The task required patience more than strength. He bent. He pulled. He moved forward. Then he repeated the process. Again. And again. And again. Hours passed this way. The sun climbed. The air grew warmer. Birds called from nearby irrigation channels. The smell of wet soil slowly gave way to the smell of dust and heat. The boy's back began to ache. His hands became sore. He continued. There was nothing unusual about this. Throughout Egypt, countless children and young adults were learning the same lesson. The body could become accustomed to almost anything. A young apprentice in a potter's workshop learned to tolerate heat from the kiln. A fisherman learned to tolerate hunger during poor seasons. A scribe learned to tolerate long hours of concentration. A servant learned to tolerate exhaustion. And a farmer learned to tolerate the endless repetition of labor. The boy paused only briefly to drink water. He looked toward the Nile. From this distance, the river appeared peaceful. It always appeared peaceful. Even during difficult years. Even during seasons when the floods were poor. Even during times of illness and loss. Perhaps that was why people trusted it. The river never pretended to be anything other than what it was. By midday, the heat had become intense. The workers gathered beneath the shade of several trees. Their meal was simple. Bread. Dried fish. Onions. Water stored in clay jars. The boy sat beside an older man from the village. The man was perhaps 50 years old. To the boy, he seemed ancient. The man's hands were thick and scarred. His face was darkened by decades beneath the sun. He ate slowly. After some time, he spoke. When I was your age, he said quietly, I thought work would become easier. The boy looked at him. The older man smiled. It doesn't become easier. He looked toward the fields. You simply become used to carrying it. Then he returned to his meal. The boy thought about those words. Not because they frightened him. Because they felt true. After the rest ended, the work resumed. The afternoon stretched before them. The heat pressed against the land. Insects hummed. Dust clung to skin. Time itself seemed to slow. Elsewhere, in a crowded town farther north, a young girl carried baskets of woven cloth through a market. She had begun helping her family years earlier. At first, she carried only one basket. Now she carried two. The streets were crowded. Merchants called out to customers. Donkeys moved slowly through the heat. Children ran between stalls. The smell of bread, fish, spices, sweat, and dust filled the air. The girl walked carefully. The baskets were heavy. But she had learned something important. If she focused only on the weight, the journey felt impossible. If she focused on the next few steps, she could continue. Perhaps this was another lesson of growing older. Life was easier to carry when carried one step at a time. As afternoon turned toward evening, the heat finally began to weaken. A breeze returned from the river. The shadows lengthened. The color of the world changed. Workers everywhere began preparing to return home. The boy in the field straightened slowly. His back hurt. His shoulders hurt. His feet hurt. He felt older than he had that morning. Perhaps he was. He and his father gathered their tools. Then they began the walk home. The road seemed longer in the evening. Everyone walked more slowly. Dust rose around their sandals. The sun sank lower and lower. When they reached the village, smoke was already rising from cooking fires. Children too young to work still played in the streets. Their laughter echoed through the warm evening air. The boy watched them for a moment. He did not envy them. Not exactly. He simply remembered. At home, his mother prepared the evening meal. His younger siblings sat nearby. His father washed his hands. The family gathered together. No one spoke very much. The day had already said enough. After they ate, the boy climbed to the rooftop. The air had become cool again. The stars were beginning to appear. He lay on his back and looked upward. His grandfather joined him after a while. The old man lowered himself carefully onto the mat. For several minutes, they simply watched the sky. Then the grandfather spoke. "When I was young," he said softly, "I wanted to become a different person when I grew older." The boy turned toward him. "Did you?" The old man smiled. "No." He looked back at the stars. "I became more of who I already was." The boy considered this. The words remained with him long after the conversation ended. As the village slowly fell silent, he continued looking upward. The stars above him were ancient. They had watched children become adults for thousands of years. They had watched boys become fathers. They had watched girls become mothers. They had watched workers grow old. And tomorrow, when the sun rose again over the Nile Valley, they would watch the lessons continue. Because in ancient Egypt, growing up was rarely a sudden change. It was a slow journey measured not in years, but in mornings worked, burdens carried, and quiet evenings spent beneath the endless sky. The stars slowly wheeled across the sky above the Nile Valley. To those who lived beside the river, the night sky was not empty. It was familiar. It returned every evening with the same patient certainty as the sunrise. Children learned its patterns while lying beside their families on rooftops. Farmers looked to it before beginning long walks to the fields. Fishermen studied it while drifting upon the dark water before dawn. And so, as another night passed, the stars watched over another generation learning the long lessons of growing up. The village slept quietly. A warm wind moved through the palm trees. Somewhere beyond the houses, a donkey shifted in its sleep. The Nile flowed onward, carrying water northward just as it had done for thousands of years. On a rooftop near the center of the village, the young boy who had spent the previous day in the field slept deeply. Exhaustion often brought peaceful sleep. His dreams were uncertain and fleeting. A memory of running through the reeds as a child. The sound of his mother's voice calling him home. The feeling of cool river water around his feet. Then the dreams faded. Morning approached. Before the first light touched the horizon, he opened his eyes. For a moment, he did not move. Above him, a few stars still remained. The air felt cool. He listened. The village was beginning to wake. He could hear someone sweeping a courtyard. He could hear the faint sound of grain being ground against stone. He could hear his father moving below. These sounds had accompanied every morning of his life. He sat up slowly. His body felt heavy. His shoulders remained sore from the previous day's labor. His hands were rough and stiff. He stretched carefully. Then he stood. The rooftop beneath his feet still held the memory of the night's coolness. Soon, the sun would take that away. He descended into the house. Inside, the familiar smells greeted him. Smoke. Bread. Dust. Warm clay. His mother looked up briefly. She smiled. Not because this day was special. Because ordinary days deserved kindness too. She handed him a piece of bread and a small cup of water. He ate quietly. His younger brothers still slept. They would wake soon enough. For now, they remained children. The boy wondered, for only a moment, how much longer that would last. Outside, the sky slowly brightened. The eastern horizon glowed pale gold. Birds began calling near the river. The village stretched and awakened. Today, However, the boy would not go to the fields. His father had other work. Repairs were needed on a storage building near the riverbank. The roof had been damaged during the previous season. The walls required strengthening. There was always something that required attention. This too was part of life. Nothing remained finished forever. Father and son gathered their tools. They walked through the village streets together. The morning air remained pleasant. Neighbors greeted one another quietly. Women swept doorways. Bakers prepared fresh bread. Merchants arranged goods for the day's trade. The smell of baking grain drifted through the air. For a brief time each morning, before the heat arrived, the world seemed gentle. They reached the storage building shortly after sunrise. It stood near the river, built of mud brick and wood. Time had worn away parts of its walls. The roof sagged slightly. Repairs would take all day. Perhaps longer. The father examined the structure. Then he began assigning tasks. The boy listened carefully. This was another lesson. Adults did not simply work. They observed. They planned. They anticipated problems. Growing older meant learning to see beyond the task directly in front of you. The boy carried mud bricks. He mixed clay. He gathered reeds. Again and again, he repeated the same movements. The sun climbed. The air warmed. The river shimmered nearby. Boats drifted slowly past. Fishermen called softly to one another. Life continued around them. At some point during the morning, the boy stopped thinking about the work itself. He simply worked. This happened often. Repetition transformed effort into rhythm. Rhythm transformed time. Before he realized it, several hours had passed. His father noticed. "You work faster now," he said quietly. The boy looked up. It was not praise. Not exactly. It was recognition. Somehow, that felt more important. He returned to his task. Elsewhere, throughout Egypt, countless other children experienced similar moments. A young apprentice potter successfully shaped a vessel without assistance. A girl carrying water balanced a larger jar than ever before. A student in a scribal school completed a difficult exercise. No celebrations followed these achievements. No ceremonies marked them. Growing up often happened without witnesses. The evidence appeared later. In stronger hands. In greater responsibilities. In the expectations others placed upon you. By midday, the heat had become overwhelming. The father and son rested beneath a small shelter beside the river. They ate bread. They drank warm water. They listened to the sounds around them. Nearby, fishermen repaired nets. A merchant boat drifted past. Birds stood motionless among the reeds. The boy looked at the river. It appeared peaceful. Yet he knew that the Nile demanded constant attention. Without it, nothing survived. Perhaps growing older was similar. From a distance, adulthood appeared calm. Up close, it required endless effort. His father closed his eyes briefly. Not to sleep. Simply to rest. The boy studied his face. He noticed things he had not noticed when he was younger. The lines around his eyes. The scars on his hands. The way he moved more slowly after hours of labor. Childhood often ended when children began to see that adults were also tired. That adults also struggled. That adults simply continued despite it. The afternoon passed slowly. The heat settled over everything. Dust clung to skin. Sweat soaked clothing. The work continued. brick after brick, tool after tool, hour after hour. Eventually, the shadows began to lengthen. The air softened. The sun descended toward the western desert. The father examined their work. He nodded. Enough had been completed for today. Together, they cleaned their tools. Then they began the walk home. The village looked different in evening light. Softer. Kinder. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played in the streets. Older people sat outside their homes, enjoying the cooler air. Dogs stretched lazily in the dust. The smell of fresh bread filled the village. The boy felt exhausted. But beneath the exhaustion was something else. Satisfaction. Not happiness. Not excitement. Simply the quiet feeling that the day had been carried successfully from beginning to end. At home, his younger brothers rushed to greet him. They asked questions. They laughed. They still possessed the energy of childhood. He smiled. Then he sat. His body welcomed the rest. As darkness settled over the village, the family gathered for their evening meal. Bread. Vegetables. A little fish. Water. Conversation came slowly. Everyone was tired. Afterward, the boy climbed to the rooftop. The stars were already appearing. His father joined him. They sat together. Neither spoke for a long time. The village grew quieter. The Nile glimmered in the distance. Finally, the father spoke. When I was young, he said softly, I believed that one day I would finish learning. The boy turned toward him. Did you? The father smiled. It was a tired smile. No. He looked toward the stars. You simply learn different things. The boy considered this. Below them, the village had nearly fallen silent. Above them, the stars continued their endless journey. And somewhere between childhood and adulthood, between lessons learned and lessons still waiting, another day beside the Nile gently came to an end. The village slept beneath a sky full of stars. The evening breeze had grown cooler. It drifted slowly across the rooftops, through the narrow streets, and over the fields beyond the village walls. The heat of the day still lingered in the mud bricks and stone pathways, but the night was patient. Hour by hour, it carried the warmth away. The boy lay awake for a little while after his father had fallen asleep. He looked upward. The stars seemed brighter on some nights than others. He did not know why. He only knew that they had always been there. When he was very young, he had believed the stars belonged only to his village. Later, he had learned that travelers far to the south saw them too. Fishermen on the river saw them. Workers in distant cities saw them. Even kings and priests looked upward at the same sky. That thought had comforted him. The world was large. But some things remained shared by everyone. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him into sleep. The Nile continued to flow. The stars continued their slow movement overhead. And somewhere in the darkness, another day prepared to begin. Before dawn, the village stirred once more. The first sounds were always the quietest. The creaking of a wooden door. The footsteps of someone carrying water. The distant cough of an elderly neighbor. The rustle of animals waking in their shelters. The boy opened his eyes. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. Then he remembered. The rooftop. The village. The Nile. The work. He sat up. The air felt cool against his skin. Around him, his family still slept. He listened to the silence. There would not be much silence later. Soon, the village would fill with movement and sound. He treasured these moments more now than he had as a child. Perhaps children did not understand silence because they had never yet been exhausted by noise. He climbed down into the house. His mother was already awake. She sat beside the grinding stone. The steady sound echoed through the room. Forward. Back. Forward. Back. The movement looked effortless. He knew it was not. He had tried it himself. The work demanded strength, patience, and time. Like so many tasks in ancient Egypt, it appeared simple only to those who had never done it. His mother looked up. "You are awake early," she said. He nodded. She smiled. Then both returned to their work. Outside, dawn slowly spread across the Nile Valley. The sky turned pale blue. Birds began calling from the riverbank. The first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the palm trees. The world awakened. Today was market day. The village would be busier than usual. His father had decided they would travel to a nearby town with several baskets of grain and a small collection of tools that needed to be traded or repaired. The boy welcomed the change. Not because it would be easier. It would not. But a different kind of work could feel like rest. After a simple meal of bread and dates, father and son prepared for the journey. The baskets were loaded carefully. The tools were wrapped in cloth. The sun had only just risen when they began walking. The road followed the Nile. It was already busy. Farmers guided donkeys loaded with produce. Merchants carried baskets suspended from wooden poles. Fishermen walked beside the river carrying nets over their shoulders. Women balanced jars and bundles with practiced skill. Children walked beside parents. Some talked. Some remained quiet. The boy noticed that the older children rarely spoke very much. Perhaps they were saving their energy. Or perhaps growing older simply brought more thoughts. The walk took several hours. As the sun climbed higher, the air grew warmer. Dust rose beneath their sandals. The river glimmered beside them. Occasionally, a boat passed slowly along the water. The boy watched the fishermen aboard. Their movements were calm and practiced. He wondered if they had also begun working when they were children. He suspected they had. In ancient Egypt, almost everyone had. Eventually, the town appeared ahead of them. It rose from the edge of the Nile in shades of brown and gold. Mud brick houses crowded together. Palm trees swayed above rooftops. Smoke drifted upward from cooking fires. Even from a distance, the sounds of the market could be heard. Voices. Animals. Tools striking stone. The creaking of wooden carts. The boy always found markets fascinating. Not because they were exciting. Because they revealed how many different kinds of labor existed. As they entered the town, he saw potters displaying freshly fired vessels. He saw weavers selling linen cloth. He saw fishermen cleaning their catch. He saw scribes sitting patiently beneath shaded awnings, writing documents for those who could not write themselves. Everywhere he looked, there were people working. Everywhere he looked, there were children learning how to work. A young apprentice carried clay vessels behind a potter. A girl helped her mother arrange woven baskets. A boy no older than 10 carried water through the crowded streets. The boy watched them. He recognized something in their faces. Not unhappiness. Not joy. Something quieter. Acceptance. The understanding that work was not separate from life. It was life. His father stopped near a merchant's stall. Business began. The boy stood nearby and waited. Waiting was another lesson. Children learned how to wait. To wait for instructions. To wait for opportunities. To wait for seasons to change. To wait for adulthood to arrive. As he waited, he observed the people around him. An old fisherman sat beneath a canopy repairing a net. His hands moved slowly but with perfect confidence. Nearby, a woman baked bread in a clay oven. The smell drifted through the market. A young servant swept dust from the entrance of a workshop. An apprentice carpenter carried wood planks larger than himself. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged. The boy wondered when he had begun to feel the same. Perhaps it had happened gradually. Perhaps it had happened without him noticing. The sun reached its highest point. The market grew hotter. The air became thick with dust and heat. People moved more slowly. Even the animals sought shade. Father and son rested beneath a fabric awning. They ate bread. They drank water. For a while, neither spoke. The boy watched the people around them. Some looked tired. Some looked older than their years. Some were children who no longer looked entirely like children. He realized something. No one ever announced that childhood was over. There was no day when the world changed. Instead, childhood slowly became memory. One responsibility replaced another. One season followed another. One morning of work became hundreds. Then thousands. The afternoon passed. The market slowly quieted. Trades were completed. Goods were packed. People prepared for the journey home. Father and son began walking back toward their village. The sun had started its descent. The light had softened. The road seemed quieter now. The boy carried one of the baskets. It felt heavier than it had that morning. Or perhaps he was simply more tired. They walked in silence. The Nile flowed beside them. Birds crossed the sky overhead. The evening breeze returned. When the village finally appeared in the distance, the boy felt relief. Not because the work had ended. Because he knew where he belonged. As they entered the village, the familiar smells greeted him. Bread. Smoke. River water. Dust. Home. Children played in the fading light. Older workers returned from the fields. Families prepared evening meals. The ordinary world continued exactly as it always had. That night, after the meal had been shared and the stars had returned, the boy climbed onto the rooftop once more. He lay beside his family. His body felt heavy. His eyes slowly closed. Tomorrow would bring more lessons. More work. More growing. But for now, beneath the endless sky of ancient Egypt, with the Nile flowing patiently through the darkness, he allowed himself the simple comfort of rest. The night air above the Nile Valley felt softer after a long day of travel. The boy slept deeply on the rooftop beside his family. Around him, the village had fallen into its familiar silence. The sounds of the market town were far away now. There were no merchants calling out prices. No crowded streets. No animals pushing through the dust. There was only the village. Only the river. Only the night. A breeze moved gently across the rooftops, carrying with it the scent of wet reeds and earth that had cooled after the day's heat. Somewhere beyond the houses, frogs called from the edge of an irrigation canal. The sound rose and fell slowly, like breathing. The stars remained overhead. They had watched this village for generations. They had watched children become workers, workers become parents, and parents become old. The boy slept through most of the night. But shortly before dawn, he woke. Not because of a sound. Not because of a dream. Simply because his body had learned the rhythm of life. For a few moments, he remained still. The sky above him was dark blue. A handful of stars still shone. The air was cool. He listened to the silence. When he was younger, he had not appreciated these moments. He had rushed through them, eager for play, eager for movement, eager for the day to begin. Now, he found himself lingering. Perhaps growing older meant learning that quiet moments were rare. Eventually, he sat up. Around him, his family still slept. He stood carefully and walked to the edge of the rooftop. The Nile glimmered faintly in the distance. He could not see much of it in the darkness. But he knew it was there. He had always known. The river was like time itself. Always moving. Always present. Never stopping. He climbed down into the house. The familiar smell of smoke and grain greeted him. His mother was awake. She always seemed to be awake before everyone else. She was kneeling beside the cooking fire, feeding small pieces of fuel into the flames. The firelight flickered across the walls. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she handed him a clay cup of water. He drank. The water was cool. It tasted faintly of clay. He thanked her quietly. Outside, the first bird called from the riverbank. Morning had begun. Today would be spent in the village. There were repairs to make. Storage jars needed cleaning. Tools needed maintenance. Animals needed care. There was never a day without work. But some days felt slower than others. After sunrise, the village gradually filled with movement. Smoke rose from rooftops. Children carried water jars. Dogs wandered through the streets. Farmers departed for the fields. The boy followed his father to a small storage building beside their home. The wooden door had become loose. Several tools required sharpening. The roof needed patching before the next rainy season. The father examined everything carefully. The boy watched. This was another lesson. Before doing any work, adults first observed. They looked. They considered. They planned. Children often believed that work consisted only of action. As they grew older, they learned that much of work happened in silence, before the labor even began. The father handed the boy a tool. Together, they began. The morning passed slowly. The sun climbed. The air warmed. The boy worked steadily. Hammering. Lifting. Carrying. Repairing. He noticed that his hands no longer hurt as much as they once had. He noticed that tasks which had once seemed difficult now felt ordinary. This realization surprised him. Not because he had become stronger. Because he had not noticed himself changing. Perhaps that was how all growing happened. Slowly enough that no one saw it happening. By late morning, the village had settled into its usual rhythm. In the street nearby, younger children played with small carved toys. They shouted. They laughed. They chased one another through the dust. The boy paused and watched them. He recognized some of their games. He remembered playing them himself. Yet the memory felt strangely distant. Not because many years had passed. Because so many responsibilities had passed between then and now. His father noticed him watching. "You used to run faster than all of them," he said. The boy smiled. "I remember." His father nodded. Then both returned to work. There was comfort in that brief conversation. It acknowledged something neither had spoken about before. Childhood had happened. Childhood had mattered. But it had also ended. Around midday, the heat became heavy. The village grew quieter. Even the children stopped playing. People sought shade beneath trees, walls, and woven shelters. The boy and his father sat beneath a canopy beside their home. They shared bread, onions, and water. The father looked toward the street. "When I was your age," he said after a while, "I thought older people knew everything." The boy looked at him. "Did they?" The father smiled. It was a small smile. "No." He drank some water. "They simply had more experience being tired." The boy laughed softly. Not because it was a joke. Because it felt true. He looked around the village. The old men sitting in the shade. The women carrying water. The workers repairing tools. Everyone looked tired. Yet everyone continued. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Not how to avoid hardship, but how to carry it. The afternoon passed slowly. Heat shimmered above the roads. Dust settled on everything. The work continued. The boy repaired handles on farming tools. He cleaned storage jars. He carried bundles of reeds. Task followed task. Hour followed hour. The rhythm felt familiar. Comfortable, even. As the sun began its journey downward, the village slowly awakened again. Doors opened. Animals stirred. Children returned to the streets. The air became easier to breathe. A breeze arrived from the river. The boy stood and stretched. His back hurt. His arms hurt. Yet he felt satisfied. Not because the work had been enjoyable. Because the work had been completed. This feeling became more important with age. Children often searched for happiness. Adults often searched for completion. As evening approached, the sky turned gold. Then orange. Then deep red. The village glowed beneath the fading light. Smoke rose into the evening air. The smell of baking bread drifted through the streets. Families gathered. Voices softened. The day released its hold. After the evening meal, the boy climbed once more onto the rooftop. His grandfather was already there. The old man sat with his legs crossed, looking toward the Nile. The boy sat beside him. For a long time, they said nothing. The stars slowly appeared overhead. One by one. Then hundreds. Then thousands. Finally, the grandfather spoke. "Do you know what surprised me most about growing older?" The boy shook his head. The old man smiled. "How quickly I stopped noticing it." The boy considered this. The grandfather continued looking at the stars. "One day you carry a small basket. Then a larger one. One day you follow your father. Then one day someone follows you." He paused. And somehow, all the years disappear in between. The night deepened around them. The village grew silent. The Nile continued its endless journey through the darkness. And beneath the ancient stars, beside his grandfather, the boy listened quietly to the sound of time itself moving forward, one ordinary day at a time. The night grew deeper over the Nile Valley. The voices of the village had long since disappeared. The cooking fires had cooled into ash. Even the dogs that wandered the dusty streets had settled into sleep. Above the world of ancient Egypt, the stars remained. They had watched countless seasons pass. They had watched the river rise and fall. They had watched children become workers, workers become parents, and parents become memories carried only in stories. The boy who had spent so many years learning the quiet lessons of life lay once more beneath the open sky. He was no longer the child who had chased birds along the riverbank. He was no longer the boy who had carried his first basket, repaired his first tool, or walked nervously beside his father to the fields. Those days had not disappeared. They had simply become part of him. The lessons had never arrived all at once. They had come with every sunrise, with every journey to the river, with every sore muscle, with every evening meal shared beside family, with every tired night beneath the stars. Growing up, he now understood, had never been a single moment. It had been thousands of ordinary moments woven together. The Nile continued to flow quietly through the darkness. Somewhere beyond the reeds, water touched the shore with a gentle sound. A breeze drifted across the rooftops. Palm leaves whispered softly. Beside him, his family slept. Their breathing rose and fell with the same calm rhythm as the river itself. He looked upward one last time. The stars seemed endless. Perhaps they had watched his grandfather when he was a boy. Perhaps they had watched his father's first day of work. Perhaps one day, they would watch another child lying beneath this same sky, wondering when childhood had quietly slipped away. But for now, there was nothing left to wonder. The work of the day was finished. The lessons of the day were complete. Tomorrow would come when it was ready. The river would continue. The sun would rise. Life would go on, as it always had. And beneath the vast and patient sky of ancient Egypt, surrounded by the soft sounds of the night and the endless flow of the Nile, the world grew quiet. Then quieter still. Until there was only the river. And the stars. And sleep.